So we've been in the series, Young and Restless. And our goal, our desire in this series for you guys is to encourage you. Like that's what I told my team. That's what we wrote down. We want you guys to be encouraged in this series. That's what's most important to us. And we want you guys to realize that even as young people, you have been called by God. You have been led by Jesus. You are being stirred by the Holy Spirit as young people to lead, to bring about good, godly change, and to set an example for other believers, even those believers that are older than you. And so what we've been doing this whole time is kind of framing this entire series through the verse 1 Timothy 4:12. And it says, "Do not let anyone look down on you because you are young, but set an examples for the believers in life and love and conduct and speech and in purity." And so that's what we really want you guys to hold on to. That don't let anyone look down on you because you're young. Don't let people sneeze at you because you're young. You're called to set an example in basically every aspect of life. Every translation has it in a different order or different words, but basically just every aspect of life. And so what we've done in this series is we sat down and schemed what are some good stories from the Bible we could tell you guys to give you good examples of young people who let out, even when no one else would. And the first one we talked about was King Josiah, our boy Josiah. And we talked about how Josiah came from this long line of bad kings. We said they're like a Marvel movie, like mostly stinkers, a good one occasionally, but mostly stinkers. And the easiest thing in the whole world for Josiah to do was to just follow along with all the bad stuff that his forefathers did. Just to worship idols, to turn away from God, to not hear the word of the Lord, and just do his own thing. Easiest thing in the whole world for him to do, because that's all he knew. But instead, Josiah heard the word of the Lord, and he obeyed it, and he called other people to obey it. And he systematically destroyed, and he systematically broke every cycle and every destructive cycle and every idol in his family's history. And Josiah, as a young person who became king at like 8 years old and did all the stuff we talked about at like age 18 years old, he looked at this track record and was like, no, 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 no. This stops with me. No more. This stops with me. And he changed the course of the nation. And so we encouraged you guys like, hey, maybe you're that person in your family. Maybe you're that person in your friend group. Maybe you're that person in your generation. You're going to break those destructive cycles and those idols that people worship instead of God, or that those things that people turn to instead of God. So that was the first week talking about our boy Josiah. The second week, we talked about our boy David. And we talked about how there was this conflict between the Israelites and the Philistines. And like all the Israelites were just scared because there was this giant guy named Goliath. And no one would fight him. And we talked about how David stepped up and stepped out in faith with full confidence in God. As a young person, as the youngest of his siblings, as a person way too young to fight in the army, he stepped out when nobody else would, when everyone else was too scared to. And we talked about, in the greater context of the story, God had used every single event in David's life to prepare him for that thing God was calling him to do as a young person, stepping out when no one else would. And that God used David's specific past and his unique gifting for God's glory. He used his past, his gifting, every single thing he encountered and experienced in his life for God's glory and to do a great work. And because of that, David overcame Goliath and again led the nation, stepped out to fight this giant when nobody else would, when all the older people were too afraid to. And so we encourage you guys, do that. Be that person. Be a David. Don't just sit back and be like, well, I'm only a freshman. Or like, oh, I'm only in 8th grade. Or like, well, I'm the youngest person in my family, so I don't want to. Like, no, dude, step up. Step out. Be a leader. Again, even when no one else is. And have confidence as you do that you're not going to step out there and just be like, oh, I don't know what to do. I don't know what's going on. And you have no safety net. No, God has used every single situation in your life, everything you've been through, all your unique skill sets and gifting to prepare you to step out and lead as a young person. So we talked about Josiah the first week, we talked about David the second week, and then the third week we talked about the disciples. And I shared with you guys kind of this, I feel like a unique perspective, something I didn't learn until later in life, that these disciples were, the evidence for this is overwhelming, were teenagers. They were young people. And if you know anything about the schooling system of the day and this whole rabbinic tradition I taught you guys about, how Jesus was like this rabbi, this teacher who would go around and teach the scriptures and make interpretations on the scriptures and even make like revolutionary claims about the scriptures and revolutionary claims about himself. these young people followed Jesus. He called a group of teenagers. You would think in modern day society, Jesus is going to call like elders of the church and wise people, or like successful businessmen, or like people of notoriety. He called a group of teenagers, and he called them away from what they're doing. And so we talked about how they believed that Jesus was the Messiah, the foretold Son of God, God in the flesh, fully God, fully man. They believed he was the Messiah, and they believed all the right things about Jesus. But then they also followed him like their rabbi. And I told you about this whole system of the day where you would follow in the footsteps of a rabbi. So if your rabbi was walking, you literally wanted to be covered in the dust of your rabbi. You wanted to follow every step with your rabbi. And so it is with us. We follow Jesus. We believe he's the Messiah, the Son of God. We believe in him and have faith in him. And because of that, you're saved. But then we also have to follow him. And so that was our encouragement to you guys. It's great to believe all the right things about Jesus. It's good to have head knowledge of Jesus, but you got to follow Jesus. And what's more, you're called to do so, even as a young person. And that Jesus called a group of teenagers to change the world. And we believe that he still is doing the same thing. And so all of you sitting out there, we don't know what you guys are going to do. We believe you're going to do big things for the kingdom of God. You're going to do very God-honoring, wonderful things in your life, and we believe in you guys. So as teenagers, don't be like, when I get older. No, now. Jesus is calling you now. And so we talked about Josiah, we talked about David, we talked about the disciples, and now we're going to end this series by actually talking about our boy Timothy, which is where we get our theme verse from in the series. Now, I need to tell you a little bit about Timothy. We're just going to do like a quick, you could go through several books of the Bible. You could go through so many stories. We're just going to keep it short and sweet. First thing that happens is Paul's in this place called Lystra and Derbe, and he hears about this young man named Timothy who has this great reputation. Like everybody likes Timothy. And Paul sees an advantage because Paul is a Jewish guy and he wants to witness to Jewish people, but he also interacts with a lot of Greek people, a lot of like non-Jewish people at the time. Well, he finds this kid that's both. He's got biracial parents. He has a mom who's Jewish and a dad who's Greek. And so he's like, oh, and so Paul sees this advantage. Timothy can talk to anybody. He can appeal to anyone. And he's heard great things about this young man. So he calls Timothy, this young man, to start following him. And so that's what happens. And they go to this place called Philippi together. They go to this place called Corinth. They go to Thessaloniki. They go to all these places you probably never heard of. All these places in Greek and Asia Minor and basically the whole known world. And Timothy follows Paul everywhere. Like they'd go on world tour together. And he's following everywhere he goes. And what we see in their relationship, we see these dynamics take place. And we're going to talk about them here in a minute. But here's what we see between Paul and Timothy. We see that Paul is a mentor to Timothy, or an example, or what he will refer to himself as a father in the faith. He's a mentor, example, and father in the faith to Timothy. He's going to model for Timothy what it looks like to be a Jesus follower, to be a missionary, to go to live life on mission and to teach people and instruct people and encourage people and lead people to Jesus. Paul's going to act that out for Timothy. But secondly, Paul's a teacher, and he teaches Timothy what to do, what not to do. He teaches him the scriptures. He teaches him the gospel and the accounts of the early disciples of Jesus, who we talked about 2 weeks ago. And so he's a teacher of Timothy. He needs Timothy to understand so that Timothy can then teach truth. Because it's great to have zeal and to have ambition and want to talk to people about Jesus, but you gotta know what you're talking about. Like that's just a thing. You gotta know what you're talking about. And so Paul imparts his knowledge, imparts his wisdom to Timothy and teaches and instructs him. Well, thirdly, Paul's a support to Timothy. And we'll talk about this here in a second, but like as Timothy goes and does different things in ministry, Paul always supports him. Paul always encourages him. Paul's always got his back. Paul's always defending him. And so, yeah, like it's good to be a mentor and example, and yeah, it's good to teach and instruct, but at the end of the day, too, like Paul's got to have Timothy's back. He's got to watch out for him. That's exactly what Paul does as they're traveling around the known world. Well, lastly, Paul is just straight up a coach to Timothy. He's constantly kind of telling him like, oh, a little more of that, a little less of this. Make sure you're doing this. Make sure you're avoiding this. Oh, real quick, heads up. Be careful about this one thing. That's a problem you're going to run into. He's constantly coaching him. And if you've ever played sports or anything that requires coaching, you know a lot of times the coach just doesn't talk to you at the beginning of the game and say, all right, so guys, we're going to go out there. We're going to run some plays and play some defense and some offense and Yeah, we'll see what happens. No, it's a little more specific than that. And the coach is a good coach is constantly making adjustments. It's exactly what Paul does with Timothy. He's constantly saying, hey, man, you're doing this. You're crushing it. Just be careful about this. Or like, hey, man, you're doing a good job, but you're stepping into ministry as a young guy, and just be careful because the dynamics are a little different. There's going to be some elders who are going to support you and some who aren't. So just like, just be careful. And so he coaches Timothy. So Paul has this nuanced, dynamic relationship with Timothy where he is a mentor, a father in the faith to Timothy. He is a teacher to Timothy. He instructs him, gives him knowledge that he's going to need to teach truth. But in that, he constantly supports Timothy. And then he has this ongoing relationship where he's able to coach Timothy, kind of guide and direct him as things constantly ebb and flow and change and vacillate. And so as they're traveling along together, that's kind of their dynamic. That's the relationship. But then Paul thinks, okay, Timothy's kind of been under my tutelage. He's been doing a good job. It's time for him to leave the nest and fly. Like, go do your thing. And so he actually sends Timothy back to a place that they were earlier called Philippi. It's one of the first places Timothy went with Paul. And Paul tells the Philippians, he writes a letter and he's like, okay, heads up, I'm sending you Timothy. And you guys know Timothy. You guys love Timothy. And he says, Timothy is, check this out, is like a son. He's like a son to me in the faith. We talked about earlier how Paul is like a father to Timothy in the faith. Paul says Timothy is like a son to me in the faith and in sharing the gospel, the good news of Jesus. He's like a son to me. So I'm sending him to you guys. And then what's more, he has a genuine love and concern for you guys. Like he straight up loves you guys. And what we see with Paul's description of Timothy is that Timothy is just a selfless, loving guy who's going to love whoever Paul sends him to, whoever Jesus leads him to share Jesus' love with. And so Timothy goes to Philippi, and he's obedient in that, and he's faithful in that, and he's bold and courageous in that. So Timothy gets sent. And he reports back to Paul. And that's where if you have ever read the letter to the Philippians, that's a lot of that like dialogical exchange, conversational exchange between Paul and the church there. But then Timothy gets this more like full-time gig. He gets this like, if you would, in modern context, like a lead pastor job at this place called Ephesus. And so Timothy, as a young guy, becomes like a lead pastor at this church in Ephesus. And so Paul starts to write to him there. And this is where we see a lot of this coaching. And this is actually where we see our kind of theme verse or our framing verse for this series. And Paul's writing to him. He's like, hey, Timothy, like, man, you're doing a good job. Just be careful of a couple of things. And he says, don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, but set an example to the believers. And he goes into that list in speech, conduct, life, love, and purity. And so he's saying like, hey, man, you're a young leader. There's going to be guys gunning for you. There's going to be old men that are going to be like, blah, 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 blah. You're just a young person. We're not going to take anything you say seriously. And Paul's like, no, man, don't let people look down on you. Just like David looked down on Goliath because he was young. Just like Josiah was young and like probably everyone looked down on him and was like, he shouldn't be king. Or how like people in Jesus' day probably looked down on the disciples because they were young. Paul likewise is warning Timothy, man, don't let people look down on you because you're young. And he reminds Timothy of his calling. And we're going to circle back to this here in just a second. He reminds Timothy of his calling to be a pastor, to be a teacher, to be a leader of people. And he reminds Timothy that these elders in the church, these older men, laid hands on Timothy and anointed him and said, hey, man, you have the gift to teach. You have the gift to preach. You have a gift to pastor God's people. And so Paul's reminding Timothy of this when he's in Ephesus. And he's encouraging Timothy in this. And then Paul encourages him. And he says, hey, man, continue to fight the good fight of faith and continue to take hold of life everlasting. Continue to just take hold of the life that Jesus has called you to. Be a Jesus follower now and live now like you would into eternity. Live now like you would if Jesus were around or if you were following Jesus. Take hold of that life, man. Fight the good fight because the Christian life isn't easy. And take hold of the life everlasting that Jesus has called you to. And so Paul encourages Timothy and is sending him all these letters as Timothy is like this lead pastor at this church in Ephesus. But then, towards the end of Paul's life, Paul ends up in this place called Rome, kind of the center of the known universe at the time. And it's like the center of the world. And Paul's there and he's under house arrest and he's going to be on trial. And so Timothy goes and visits Paul there and spends time with Paul towards the end of Paul's life. Timothy is very faithful to Paul. He actually gets a chance at the end of Paul's life to be a support and an encouragement to Paul. And so then as Paul's in Rome, and he's kind of wrapping things up, and he writes his second letter to Timothy, and he's kind of, Paul's even saying at this point, he's like, hey man, I've fought the good fight, I've finished the race, I've kept the faith, I've done what Jesus has called me to do, and I know I have stored up for me a crown of righteousness. I can't wait to be with Jesus. And so like, Paul's kind of like giving his farewell address or like a goodbye letter. It's really cool because earlier when Paul's writing a letter to the Philippians, he says that Timothy is like a son to him in the faith. Well, at the end of his life, when Paul is in house arrest and prison in Rome, and he's kind of at the end of things, he refers to Timothy as a co-worker in the faith. And so Timothy's gone through this journey with Paul, this maturation, this education, this experience, and he's grown to the point where he's no longer Paul's son in the faith, but he's Paul's co-worker in the faith. And we see from the day that Paul called this young whippersnapper, Timothy, into ministry to the end of Paul's life, they become like brothers. They become compatriots. They become co-workers in the faith. And so here's what I want us to kind of take away from that. Here's what I want to suggest to you guys today. I think it's really, really important. This isn't like a punchline. This is just something I'm going to tell you to do. It is really, really important to have some kind of a mentor in your life, some kind of spiritual father or mother in the faith, someone you can look up to, someone who can be an example to you. Because, yeah, our theme verse says, set an example for the believers in life, love, purity, conduct, speech, all that stuff. But what we see with Timothy is, yeah, he was called to lead as a young person. But you are not autonomous. You're not self-sufficient. You're not like on your own, I got this as a young person. No, you should always have someone older speaking into your life. And so let's just look at Paul and Timothy's relationship, the whole mentor relationship, or a father in the faith, or a mother in the faith. Just to share kind of part of my journey with you guys, I've had several of these over the years. And I've had people specifically model for me or be great examples to me of the kind of man that I want to be, or the kind of pastor that I want to be. My youth pastor growing up, his name was George Wisely. And great dude. He's kind of, I think he was in his 40s when he was our youth pastor, which, you know, that might be a little old for youth pastor. I'm 31 now, and sometimes I feel like I'm old. Like I got a back thing going on. I got a bum hip. But he was even older than that. But he was young. Like he acted young. He was energetic. And he was just a great, godly man. He loved Jesus. He loved students. He loved his wife. He loved his kids. I don't think I ever saw the dude ever get angry. Like I honestly don't think a single time. He broke his back for the church. He served the church well. Dude did not make a ton of money working in ministry, and he was working like 3 jobs in ministry. And it was just so inspiring for me to sit back and watch him because I'm like, man, this dude has a genuine faith. Like he has a genuine love of people. I want to be like George when I grow up, man. And we had a smaller youth group than, say, like Sublime, and we called it youth group back then. But we had a smaller group. But because of George's example and leadership, a lot of the students in the small group went on to do big things, or like a lot of us honestly went into ministry. So I have another friend named Brad in Arkansas, and he's a youth pastor. I've got some other friends from that group that like they serve. One serves in like an inner city ministry. Some of them have gone on to become missionaries, and then some of them too go on to serve in like family ministry. Like I know like 1 or 2 of them are married to pastors, and they minister to or like they're married to student pastors, and they minister to a lot of the girls in that student ministry. So because of George's example, this group of teenagers, just like the disciples, went on to do great things for the kingdom. And so I always looked up to George and was like, man, I want to be like that guy. Another person like that in my life was this guy named Keith. He was a pastor I worked for at my last church. And he'd even tell you, he'd be like, oh, I might not be the best at this or the best at that. But the one thing I thought he was incredible at was pastoral care. He cared about people so much. Like if someone had the sniffles, he'd like call them and be like, can I bring you anything? Some ginger ale, some saltine crackers, which, by the way, I don't know why we always have those when we have a cold. I don't know what the remedy is for that. I don't know what the science is behind that. Chicken noodle soup, saltines, and ginger ale. I don't know why that's the cure-all. I'm not sure what that's about. Anyway, I digress. But he would always go and visit people. If anyone was in the hospital, even if it was like your friends, moms, uncles, roommates, friend was in the hospital, he'd go see them. And he was just a boss at it. He had so much margin for it. We had people in our church that would like call him at like 4:30 in the morning and be like, hey, we have to go, my daughter has to go get a tonsillectomy at the last second. And he'd be like, okay, I'll meet you at the hospital. And so I saw that in Keith, and I thought, man, like that might be a lost art today. And so I had some great examples model some awesome stuff for me between George and just the way he lived his life and the way he did ministry, or Keith, the way he cared about people and was always there for people. And even with Keith, loved the way he treated his family. He had this rule that if we were in a meeting and his wife called, he'd always like, if we were in an important meeting, he'd be like, okay, guys, listen up. This is going to forever change the course of this church. His wife would call, he'd be like, gotta go. And he straight up just like leave the middle of a meeting because he loved his wife, he loved his family so much that he's like, hey man, that's way more important. I gotta take this. Which, by the way, no one has a phone shaped like this anymore. I don't know why I did that. I don't know what this is. So I had someone model and provide an example for me, just like Paul did for Timothy. Secondly, I've had great teachers. Just like Paul was a great teacher to Timothy, I've had some great teachers that I've known. One of my mentors in college was this guy named Eric Bolger. Brilliant teacher. He gave me such a love, or instilled in me such a love for Scripture. And he taught me to read Scripture in such a different way, in such a more compelling way that I couldn't put the thing down. And it was awesome because I got to take, as an undergrad, I got to take a lot of Bible classes with him. He taught me Hebrew. He actually let me teach Hebrew by the time I was a senior, and so he gave me opportunities. And I learned so much from him that today influences every single thing I do in ministry. The way I teach, the way I read the Bible. And so I'm forever grateful for Eric Bolger because he was someone that, as a mentor figure, was able to teach me, like Paul was able to teach Timothy and impart knowledge. I actually have a friend now, his name's Rabbi Kevin. He's a Messianic Jewish rabbi, which means like he's Jewish by ancestry, and his parents were Jewish, but then they came to faith in Jesus, or what they would say Yeshua, his Jewish name. And so Rabbi Kevin's been an awesome friend to me and a mentor to me in that he teaches me things about Jesus I didn't know. Because Jesus, living in the first century, grew up in a Jewish culture and context. And so that influences, and we talked about this in one of our lessons, that influences a lot of Jesus' dealings and a lot of what he did. And so Rabbi Kevin's been awesome because he's taught me a lot of things about the Jewish roots of the faith, about, hey, here's some prayers Jesus would have prayed growing up in the synagogue. And when I go to Rabbi Kevin's synagogue, like they pray those same prayers that Jesus did. Or he teaches me some things about like the Last Supper or like the Passover that I really didn't know, because I didn't know about the Jewish roots of it, or I didn't know as much as I wanted to. So he's been awesome in being able to teach me. So you need someone like that in your life, like someone like a Dr. Bolger, the Eric Bolger, this guy who taught me a lot, or like this guy Rabbi Kevin, my friend now. Somebody who can teach you well, whether that's a pastor, whether that's a group leader, whatever that is. You need someone that can teach you. So you need a mentor, an example. You need a teacher, and we just like in Paul and Timothy's relationship. But then you also need someone who's going to support you. And I've been blessed. There's actually a pastor on staff here named Bud Dar. And Bud Dar brought me off the streets. I didn't have a job. He brought me off the streets, and he gave me a shot here at North Metro 4 years ago, something like that. And I was an intern with Bud. And I learned so much about working in a church with Bud. I learned so much about organization and about leadership. And Bud Dar was just one of these guys who's always had my back, who's always looked out for me. Even when I got another job at a different church, Bud would always stay in contact with me, and I'd always stay in contact with him. And he'd constantly support me and constantly just ask me how I'm doing. And then like he even was like super supportive in me stepping into this role. And so I tell him all the time, I'm like, man, I'm forever grateful for you, Bud Dar, because you were able to speak into my life. And he's that support. Just like Paul constantly supported Timothy, he's been a support to me. Likewise, I had this friend at my last church. His name's Emmanuel Fanji. He's from Cameroon, Africa. And just like one of the kindest, warmest people I've ever met. He and I actually started working together to start this ministry called Christmas for Cameroon, where we actually bring Christmas presents to kids living in orphanages in Cameroon that otherwise wouldn't get Christmas presents. And so he's like a brother to me, and also kind of like a father figure mentor to me, just because I'm like, man, he's so selfless. Because when I was actually asking him about this whole Christmas for Cameroon idea, it all stemmed from this conversation we had where I was like, hey, Emmanuel, what would you do if you won the lottery? And he said, Pastor Matt, I would go to Cameroon and I would provide presents and gifts for children in these orphanages that wouldn't have them otherwise. And I was like, dang, dude, I'll probably buy like a Tesla or like a fancy car. Honestly, that's probably what I would do. So I felt convicted. So we started this ministry together, and he always supported me in it. And then even at my church that I moved here from, he always was supporting me, always sending me text messages. He and his family said they were adopting me and that they would want to look out for me, and if I ever need anything, I could come stay with them. And even as I'm in this role here at North Metro, he still checks in on me. He's a support to me. And so you need a mentor, an example. You need someone to teach you. And you need someone to support you who's going to have your back and just encourage you in the faith. And then lastly, you need a coach. Just like Paul and Timothy, you need a coach. Someone who can kind of walk beside you, who can watch over you and just say, watch that, watch this. And I actually was blessed with the opportunity to do this at the church that I moved here from. I was in charge of the bands, and we had a youth group band. We called it youth group there, like a Sublime band if it was here. And I had these kids these students that were really raw musically, and I got to help train them up. And just like Jordan and the band have here, they had in-ear monitors. And what I would have to do for the first probably 2 or 3 months that they were leading music is I'd have to be in the back behind the sound booth being like, okay, transition. Okay. You guys you're 2 clicks off the click track, like get back on point. Or sometimes I'd be like, you guys are killing it, because I'd know like they'd feel nervous. I'd be like, you guys are killing it. And so I'd be talking to them in their ears where no one else could hear. And as they were going through a song, I could kind of say like, hey, watch your tempo. I'd be like, hey, watch your pitch as you're singing. Hey, articulate a little more. Hey, a little closer to the mic. Hey, a little further away from the mic. Hey, really build that beat. And so I was able to kind of be in their ear and coach them along. And they'd kind of stray and they would get back on course. And it got to a point where I had to do that less and less. And so that was a cool experience for me to be able to coach them to the point where I would just say, all right, count down 3, 2, 1, go. And I wouldn't have to say anything else. And so it was a cool thing for me to see that, like, I was able to coach them like that. And so when I was reading all this stuff about Paul and Timothy, I saw that. Paul would constantly be in Timothy's ear, if you will, or constantly send him letters saying like, hey man, like be encouraged. Hey man, be warned about this. Hey man, fight the good fight. Because it's good in your Christian faith to be out there and you're fighting. But at the same time, like, you need someone at your back to encourage you. Just like a boxer has a coach in his corner, you need that coach in your corner. And so just like Paul and Timothy, you need a mentor, example, you need a teacher, you need someone who's going to support you, you need someone who's going to coach you up. But some of you, this is kind of the last thing we're going to land on today. I'd be remiss if I didn't go into this. Some of you are very specifically called, like Timothy, to being a pastor, being a preacher, being a shepherd of God's people. And some of you are going to have a Paul come along in your life and tell you that and say, hey man, you're called. Follow me. I'll train you up. I'll be a mentor to you. I'll support you and I'll coach you. And so some of you have that specific calling on your life. And Paul actually writes about that in 1 Timothy in chapter 4. And he says, hey man, like don't forget when the elders, we talked about this earlier, when the elders surrounded you and put their hands on you and said, hey, you have the gifting to do this. Remember that. Immerse yourself in scripture because of it. Practice teaching well. And so some of you sitting out there today are going to be future pastors. Some of you are going to be people that work in ministry, whether it's a support at a church or leadership in a church. Some of you are going to be missionaries. Some of you have a very specific calling in your life. And I thought about this as I was writing the series. Some of you have a very specific calling on your life. And so I just want you to be aware of that as you move forward. Look for people to speak into your life. I know I was an associate pastor at this church, and I was given these opportunities to preach on Sunday that I didn't think I was going to get. And I would several times, time and again, have these older pastors that were visiting from out of town come up to me and say, young man, I need you to pay attention to this. You are gifted and called to do this. You know that, right? Like, you know you're called to do this. Went to another church, same thing. People would come up and say, hey, and it was elders in the church, wise people in the church, just godly men and women, just loyal, faithful Christ followers. And they would come up to me and say, hey, you're meant to be doing this. This is the thing that you should do. Likewise, I actually had this, it was really encouraging. It was discouraging and encouraging at the same time, but I had this job interview I went on like 2 years ago, and this lead pastor was interviewing me, and we kind of figured out it wasn't the right fit, right time for the job, but this lead pastor spoke into my life, and he said, hey man, I really believe that God's calling you to be a pastor. I think you're doing what you're supposed to, and I would encourage you in that. And that meant the world to me because you need that. I mean, biblically, it says you need to have elders tell you, like, yeah, you're ordained to do this. You're called to do this. So for some of you sitting out there, you're going to have a very specific calling on your life. Don't run from that. When elders speak into your life and they encourage you in that, like, listen to that junk. That's good. So as you guys leave here tonight, I would encourage every single one of you to find someone who can be like that father or mother in the faith to you, like Paul was to Timothy. Find someone who can be a model and an example, whose life you want to emulate. Like, yeah, I want to be like them. Find someone who can teach you well, who can impart wisdom and knowledge to you. Find someone who's going to support you and have your back. Even if it's like, man, I don't need advice right now. I don't need advice right now. I just need support. And find someone that can kind of coach you along the way. And I'm going to be honest with you. We kind of have a system in place for that. It's called small groups. And so you have a group leader. And part of the group leader's job, even if you think like, I don't want to be like them, hopefully that's not the case. We haven't built the ministry that way. But if you're thinking that, or if you're just like, well, I get more of the teaching from like when we sit in service, okay, fine. But if nothing else, they will be a support to you. If nothing else, they can coach you up. And I cannot tell you, with our groups ministry here, how many stories I've heard of people saying like, hey man, I had the same group leader for like 4 years. Hey man, I had the same group leader for like 8 years. And I was actually talking to one of our group leaders the other day. Awesome guy, super wise, hilarious, great conversation. And he was saying that when he was in Echo, which was our former college ministry here, his small group leader, he still would talk to him, confer with him, ask his advice, even like when he wasn't in Echo anymore. And his group leader helped one of our current group leaders make major life decisions. Even helped him career-wise, like helped get him on a career path. And so in a way, like he was able to support and coach. He was able to be an example. This group leader of ours that I talked to the other day said, man, I just want to be like that guy. Like he's one of the wisest guys I know. And I've heard countless stories. Women who have led small groups for years and 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 years. And then like now, I think like they'd started out in like student or like kids ministry, and now these women are still in contact with these girls that they were group leaders to, and these girls are now like in their 30s. And there's been years of relational equity, years of mentoring, setting an example, teaching, coming alongside and supporting and coaching up. And so I would say, man, like invest in your group. Look to your group leader. Or if there's just someone else in the church, find someone in your life. If you have an FCA huddle leader, if you have someone in your family that's really wise and discerning and you feel like, oh, this is a good godly example, find that person, find mentors, collect them. Okay, like I'm sending you on a scavenger hunt for mentors. And so that is my prayer for you today. That is my hope for you guys. That, yeah, step out and lead as young people, but never do so autonomously, so on your own, so rogue that you don't have someone older than you speaking into your life, speaking wisdom to you. So that's my encouragement for you guys today. And talk about that in your groups. Who could that person be? Where can you find that person? What would that relationship dynamic look like? And then I would encourage some of you, and tell some of you straight up, some of you will be called to ministry someday. Like odds are with the number of students we have here, one of you is going to be called into ministry. Always have a keen ear for those elders in your life that speak that truth to you and say, hey, you're called to do this. Working in ministry is a calling, man. Otherwise, it ain't easy. And so I would say, don't do it. But if you're called to do it, absolutely do it. And listen to those elders. But above all, make sure that you're following and that you're influenced by the ultimate example, Jesus. Realize what Jesus has done going ahead of us, putting us in right standing with God, the grace that Jesus extends to us, the forgiveness Jesus extends to us, the love Jesus extends to us, even while we mess up and we turn away from Jesus all the time. Realize what Jesus has done, always welcoming us back, always calling us forward into more faithful following of him, always providing that example of what to do. Look to Jesus. It says in the scriptures, look to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and now we see it at the right hand of the Father. So as you continue in your maturation, your maturity in your faith, have those mentors. Listen for your calling, if that is your specific calling. But ultimately, just keep your eyes on Jesus and follow faithfully. And so that was my prayer for you guys. And so as we wrap up this series, may you, Sublime, even though you're young, step out and lead. And may you bring about good, godly change. And may you set an example to others in every aspect of life. But may you also find that person that can speak life into you as you endeavor to help people find and follow Jesus. Grace and peace to you, Sublime. Can't wait to see you guys next week.